galaxy was burning, and even from the cold void of space, the glow of 1,000 systems of flame was visible against the blackness. The Imperium of Man, vast and unyielding, stretched across star systems, each planet a jewel of human endeavor, now tainted with blood and fire. Yet, nowhere was the shadow of betrayal darker than within the heart of the Emperor's own legions. The Horus Heresy was not a tale of a simple rebellion, but of brotherhood turned against brotherhood, of angels of war succumbing to temptation, and of the fragility of trust in the face of cosmic ambition. Horus, war master and favored son of the Emperor, once the shining exemplar of loyalty, now marched beneath the banner of treachery. His voice, once a beacon of hope to the legions, had become a whisper of corruption that crept through the minds of men. The whispers were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a wind stirring the leaves of a vast forest. A suggestion here, a doubt there. Soon, those whispers became roars of temptation, and the seeds of rebellion took root in the hearts of the Primarchs themselves. On the bridge of the flagship Vengeful Spirit, Horus stood gazing at the stars through the reinforced obsidian viewport. His armor gleamed with ceremonial splendor, every plate etched with runes of authority, yet the light in his eyes was different, sharp, calculating, tinged with an almost ecstatic sense of purpose. Around him, his officers moved with disciplined precision, unaware that the man they revered as the greatest of warriors had turned against the very emperor they swore to serve. Even the strongest of them felt the unease that hung like a premonition in the air, though none dared speak it aloud. The Primarchs of the traitor legions gathered in council, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the deck. Ongran of the World Eaters, his body marked by ritual scars, exhaled through clenched teeth, each breath a testament to barely contained rage. Fulgrim, the Phoenician perfectionist, ran a fingertip along the hilt of his elegant sword, his mind clouded by the whispers of demonic temptation that promised transcendence through beauty and death alike. Lorgar, the word-bearer, stood still, almost statuesque, his eyes reflecting the cold fire of fanatic devotion. Each had been persuaded by Horus' vision. Each had been shown a truth so intoxicating that it blinded them to the consequences of their rebellion, but not all were convinced. Some, like Rogel Dorn, loyal to the Emperor and steadfast, sensed the rot spreading through the ranks. His communication lines with Terra had been disrupted mysteriously, messages lost or delayed, and rumors whispered by scattered scouts spoke of legionaries abandoning their posts under strange influences. He clenched his fists, picturing the inevitable conflict that would tear the Imperium apart. Even now, his mind raced through defensive strategies, fortifying worlds against a betrayal he knew was coming but could not yet fully contain. The heresy did not announce itself with thunder and lightning. It crept in quietly, in small acts of defiance, in doubts sown in the hearts of commanders, in secret meetings held in shadowed corridors of ships traveling between war zones. On the planet Istvan III, the first blood had been drawn in a subtle but horrifying way. Loyalist elements had been lured into ambushes by comrades they trusted, only to find themselves under fire from weapons they had once shared. Atmospheres turned into tombs as plasma fire and bolter shells tore through the skies. Survivors fled into the jungles or caves, only to face the cold reality that even their brothers in arms could no longer be trusted. In the midst of this, a lone scout of the Luna Wolves moved through the twisted wreckage of a downed transport, his armor scorched and dented, his eyes wide with shock. He had once looked up to Horus with unshakable faith, but the realization of betrayal clawed at his mind like a living thing. He remembered the camaraderie of battle, the shared victories, the quiet moments between campaigns when laughter had filled the corridors of their ships. And now, those memories were poisoned by the knowledge that the man he had worshipped had orchestrated the slaughter of his brothers. The whispers of the warp had begun to take hold. They were not uniform, not like a single voice commanding obedience, but rather an insidious symphony of temptation and doubt. Each pre-march, each captain, each warrior experienced it differently. For some, it was a promise of power beyond imagining. For others, it was the call of vengeance against perceived slights or injustices. For Horus, it was clarity, the The realization that the Emperor's vision, rigid and absolute, was flawed. Humanity's survival, he believed, demanded evolution, and that evolution demanded sacrifice, including the sacrifice of loyalty itself. On Terra, the imperial palace was a hive of tension. The emperor, aware of the growing unease, studied the reports with an intensity bordering on obsession. His psychic perception sensed distortions, ripples of malice that no ordinary sensor could detect. He called upon his advisors, whispered warnings of heresy, and issued orders to reinforce critical worlds. Yet, he did not act rashly. Even as Horus' betrayal became inevitable, he sought a path to salvage the loyalty of his sons, to prevent the galaxy from descending into chaos. But the wheels of the heresy had already been set in motion. The loyalty of legions was fracturing faster than he could mend, and the whispers of rebellion spread like a plague. Meanwhile, across the stars, other traitor legions mobilized. Word-bearers conducted arcane rituals, their chants resonating with energies that should not exist in the material universe. Thousand Suns delved deeper into forbidden sorceries, bending reality in ways that terrified even themselves. Death Guard embraced the slow corruption of their bodies and souls, believing it to be the purification of flesh through decay. And all of this, unknown to the common soldiers of the legions, was orchestrated by Horus' unseen hand, guiding each step toward the eventual confrontation that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The scale of the betrayal was incomprehensible to the average legionary. Many had joined the legions to fight for humanity, to protect worlds from Xenos and heretic alike, and yet found themselves pawns in a war that had become political, spiritual, and moral in equal measure. On the battlefields of Istvan III, soldiers fought side by side with brothers they would soon be forced to kill. Confusion reigned as orders conflicted, as loyalty was questioned, as the reality of war shifted from black and white to a spectrum of moral ambiguity. In the shadows of this grand cosmic tragedy, small acts of heroism and horror unfolded simultaneously. A company of loyalists on Istvan III had barricaded themselves in a ruined manufactorum, repelling waves of traitor attacks. Their sergeant, a man of simple courage, had lost half his men in a single day but refused to surrender. Every shot he fired was a testament to the bonds of true brotherhood, even as the faces of his enemies were those of friends and comrades he had known since the days of recruitment. The psychic screams of the warp whispered in his ears, urging him to despair, to question his loyalty, but he clung to hope as a drowning man clings to driftwood in a storm. Yet, even in moments of courage, the heresy exacted its toll. Systems loyal to the Emperor fell under subtle sabotage, supply chains were poisoned, reinforcements delayed or destroyed. Entire planets were plunged into chaos not by the overwhelming force of armies, but by betrayal from within. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, was like a great tree whose roots had been poisoned, strong on the surface but fatally weakened at its core. And Horus, once the shining champion, now moved with the patience of a predator, knowing that the final strike would be all the more devastating because it would come from the inside. Among the traitor Primarchs, debates erupted in private chambers. Some questioned the ultimate cost, some reveled in the power they had seized, and some, like Onron, struggled to reconcile their rage-driven instincts with the subtler manipulations of Horus' cunning. But the bond between them, forged through years of war and shared victories, had been corrupted beyond repair. Alliances formed and broke as quickly as the tides, loyalty a commodity bought and sold with promises of power and vengeance. Each Primarch wrestled with conscience and ambition, though for some the struggle was little more than a shadow, easily ignored. As the first part of the Horus Heresy unfolded, the galaxy itself seemed to mourn. Worlds burned, civilizations collapsed, and yet the human heart, resilient and defiant, continued to resist. The loyalists, scattered and desperate, clung to survival, drawing strength from memory, hope, and the belief that the Emperor, however distant, would not abandon them. Every act of defiance, every rescued child, every shield raised against overwhelming odds, became a tiny ember in a universe threatened by consuming darkness. The heresy was not merely a war of armies. It was a war of ideals, a confrontation between vision and reality. Horus saw a galaxy remade under his guidance, a humanity free from the rigid control of the Emperor, yet the cost was immeasurable. Millions would die, and the bonds of brotherhood would be shattered forever. The moral weight of this war pressed down on all who participated, and in the silence between battles, the survivors would hear it, the quiet, terrible truth of betrayal, that loyalty could be twisted, love corrupted, and that even the greatest heroes could fall into shadows if seduced by power in that darkness. The stage was set for the unimaginable. The War Master's machinations, the subtle corruption of legions, the psychic manipulations of the warp, and the fragile hope of loyalists would collide in a storm that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. And yet, amid the chaos, the human spirit, ever defiant, would continue to burn. Soldiers would fight, Primarchs would question, and the Emperor himself would watch, a silent god burdened with the knowledge of betrayal and the grim reality that the path to salvation was paved with blood and suffering. The story of the Horus Heresy had begun, not with a single act of violence, but with the slow, inexorable unraveling of trust. From the shadows, Horus smiled, knowing that the galaxy would soon learn the price of ambition, the fragility of brotherhood, and the grim reality that even gods can bleed. And so, as stars burned and worlds fell, the die was cast, and the universe waited for the first move in a game whose consequences would echo across eternity. The smoke from Isstvan III had barely cleared when the next phase of Horus' grand design began. The loyalist legions, battered and demoralized, struggled to regroup. Messages sent to Terra were intercepted or twisted, turning allies into enemies before they even arrived. The Imperium's vast communication network, once a symbol of unity, now hummed with deception, a subtle signal that betrayal was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Soldiers in distant systems awoke to find their chains of command broken, orders contradictory, and once trusted officers missing or corrupted on the shattered plains of Isstvan III. The loyalist survivors crawled from ruined manufactorums, their bodies scorched, their armor shattered, their souls scarred. They moved as phantoms through the ruin, scavenging weapons, salvaging armor, and burying the dead wherever they could. Each step was a struggle against despair, yet every soldier knew that surrender was not an option. Loyalty to the Emperor had become a lifeline, the only tether to humanity in a galaxy collapsing into chaos. Among the ranks, whispered conversations spoke of Horus' name with both fear and disbelief. Once a hero of mankind, he had become the architect of devastation. The War Master, aboard the vengeful spirit, orchestrated these events with meticulous patience. He communicated with the traitor legions through secure channels, issuing orders that seemed independent but were perfectly synchronized to maximize confusion and destruction. His mind worked like a war machine, calculating contingencies for contingencies, predicting the loyalty of his brothers, and exploiting weaknesses with surgical precision. Even the smallest hesitation or error among his allies was magnified into a tool for control. Meanwhile, on worlds still loyal to the Emperor, governors and planetary defense forces struggled to comprehend the scale of the crisis. Entire fleets of support ships vanished, either destroyed or turned against their brethren. Logistic chains faltered, and resources grew scarce. On one water world, a planetary governor watched from the command tower as one of his starports erupted in flames. The attackers were their own brothers in the Imperial Navy, ships that had once protected trade routes now unleashed upon civilians with cold efficiency. The governor's mind raced for solutions, yet every option seemed to evaporate under the weight of betrayal. Even among the traitor legions, cracks began to appear, though they were buried beneath surface loyalty. Fulgrim's obsession with perfection had started to clash with Angren's fury-driven pragmatism. The word-bearer's rituals disturbed the senses of other Primarchs, their chants vibrating through the warp and creating ripples that threatened to destabilize even Horus' control. Each Primarch, while loyal to the rebellion in name, struggled with the consequences of their ambitions and the morality of slaughtering those who had once been their closest companions. But Horus' presence, His calm authority and whispered promises held them in line. Even when fear or doubt arose, his vision of a galaxy reborn under their guidance overshadowed their hesitation. The surviving loyalists from Istvan III made their way to secondary rendezvous points, their numbers depleted but their determination unwavering. Among them was a young captain of the Luna Wolves, his face scorched and his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the roar of bolter fire. He had watched comrades die in ways that defied comprehension, watched brothers cut down by those they had trusted, and yet he pressed forward. Every world he passed was scarred. Every colony he visited bore witness to the consequences of betrayal, and yet hope flickered stubbornly in his heart. Across the stars, the galaxy itself seemed to respond to the heresy. Warp storms grew more frequent, the veil between reality and the immaterium thinning in places where the psychic influence of the traitor legions was strongest. Entire systems experienced catastrophic phenomena. Suns flickered and dimmed, planetary atmospheres became toxic, and psychic echoes of the dead haunted the battlefields. It was as if the universe itself recognized the monumental rupture in the fabric of loyalty and justice. A Horus plan required subtlety as much as force. Not every confrontation was to be direct. In some systems, he allowed loyalist forces to believe they were still in control, guiding them toward traps and ambushes. In others, traitor forces infiltrated supply lines, sabotaging weapons, food, and medical supplies to weaken the resolve of the defenders. The galaxy became a chessboard, with entire worlds as pawns and star systems as pieces sacrificed to achieve strategic advantage. The moral cost, he believed, was justified by the vision of a unified humanity, freed from the limitations imposed by the Emperor's rigid ideals. Among the loyalist survivors, rumors of Horus corruption spread like wildfire. Tales emerged of entire regiments turning upon each other without warning, of psychic interference causing men to see their friends as monsters, and of whispered seductions that led even the strongest warriors to fall into despair. In the barracks of fortified planets, commanders gathered their men to warn them, to inspire courage, and to instill discipline, but they knew that fear was the enemy. Every soldier had to fight not only the traitor legions, but also the creeping doubt in their own minds. The heresy was as much psychological as it was physical, a war on perception, trust, and the very nature of humanity's loyalty, but on the outskirts of the Sol system. A fleet loyal to the Emperor awaited reinforcements that would never arrive. Communications with Terra were intermittent, intercepted, or redirected. Fleet commanders sent requests for guidance, only to receive replies that seemed to mislead them or delay action. In one command bridge, a young fleet admiral studied star charts with trembling hands. The data before him was contradictory, showing enemy movements that defied logic and friend fleets that appeared where they should not. The weight of command pressed heavily upon him, yet retreat was not an option. To abandon the Emperor's cause was unthinkable, yet pressing forward meant certain slaughter. Meanwhile, the word-bearers conducted their rituals on a darkened moon orbiting a dead star. Their chants resonated across space, drawing energies from the warp itself. Lorgar, their Primarch, stood at the center of a circle of runes, his eyes closed in ecstasy as he communed with powers that mortals could scarcely comprehend. The air shimmered with psychic energy, and for those attuned to the warp, whispers of forgotten deities filled their minds. The Loyalist legions remained unaware of the full extent of these powers, and yet the consequences were already beginning to manifest in distant systems, where psychic anomalies disrupted navigation, communication, and combat operations. In another sector, Onron led the World Eaters in a brutal campaign against a Loyalist fortress world. The sky was blackened by smoke, the surface pocked with craters from orbital bombardments. Angren's berserkers tore through defenses with relentless fury, their rage feeding the warp-tainted weapons they wielded. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and soldiers fought not only to repel them, but also to survive the feral onslaught of former brothers. Amid the chaos, the difference between victory and annihilation became a matter of inches, breaths, and seconds. Every decision carried consequences that would echo for decades, shaping the future of entire star systems. Horus, Watching these operations unfold from the bridge of the vengeful spirit felt a satisfaction that bordered on divine. His vision of a galaxy remade, cleansed of the rigidity he believed was holding humanity back, seemed to be unfolding perfectly. And yet, even he could not ignore the signs of instability. Certain legions showed cracks in their loyalty, hesitations that had to be addressed. Whispers of dissent, though minor, were noted, and subtle interventions ensured that those cracks did not widen. For all his cunning, Horus understood that absolute control over free will was impossible, and that the smallest error could unravel years of careful planning. Amid the ongoing conflict, small acts of resistance persisted. Loyalist commandos infiltrated traitor-held territories, sabotaging weapons factories, rescuing prisoners, and leaving trails of subversive intelligence. On one frozen world, a squad of Imperial fists, led by a sergeant whose face bore the scars of decades of war, held a narrow pass against overwhelming odds. Each day was a battle not only for survival, but for the preservation of morale, and each night brought nightmares of betrayal, the faces of fallen comrades, and the whispers of the warp. Yet even in these dire circumstances, courage endured. The human cost of the heresy was staggering. Millions perished in battles, ambushes, and psychological collapse. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and planetary populations were enslaved or annihilated. Yet the narrative of heroism continued, carried in the stories of those who resisted against insurmountable odds. Soldiers who had once been ordinary men became legends through sheer resilience, defiance, and courage. These stories, whispered through battered communication networks and secret transmissions, became the lifeblood of hope for the loyalists scattered across the stars. Even as the conflict spread, the psychological manipulation wrought by the heresy grew more complex. Soldiers who had seen their brothers die or turn against them experienced profound trauma. Loyalty became both a shield and a burden, and every choice carried weight. Men whispered in dark corners, questioning their commanders, their purpose, and their faith. The very concept of honor was tested daily, and for many, the question became not whether they could survive, but whether they could survive with their humanity intact. As Part 2 of the Horus Heresy unfolded, the universe itself seemed to tremble under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and war. The galaxy became a stage for human suffering and heroism, for cunning and deception, for rage and despair. And in the center of it all, Horus moved like a god among mortals, his vision guiding the actions of millions, his betrayal shaping the destiny of countless systems, and his ambition threatening to engulf the very soul of humanity. The grim reality was clear. This was not a war that could be contained, negotiated, or easily resolved. Every battle, every act of sabotage, every whisper of deceit was a thread in a tapestry of destruction that would span the galaxy. And yet, even in the darkest hours, glimmers of resistance, courage, and human spirit persisted. In these small embers of defiance lay the possibility that, even in the shadow of betrayal, humanity might endure. The galaxy had grown colder. Systems that had once thrived under the careful governance of the Imperium now lay in ruins or teetered on the edge of chaos. The heresy was no longer a subtle current. It was a tidal wave sweeping across star systems, swallowing loyalist worlds, twisting the fabric of trust and honor, and leaving only devastation in its wake. On the edges of the Segmentum Solar, fleets loyal to the Emperor assembled, but even as they prepared for confrontation, they felt the oppressive shadow of betrayal pressing upon them. Every report was suspect. Every scout could be compromised, and every maneuver could be a trap. The first major clash of the legions loomed on the horizon, a battle that would come to define the early stages of the heresy, a confrontation that would test the loyalty, courage, and humanity of those involved. On the barren planet of Kolth, loyalist forces had established a fortified position, determined to hold the world against the advancing word-bearers. The Defenders, a coalition of ultramarines and auxiliary Imperial forces, worked tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable assault. Trenches were dug, bunkers reinforced, and every available weapon brought to bear. Morale was high, but fear lingered like a specter over the ranks. Every soldier understood that the enemy was no ordinary foe. These were their brothers in arms, twisted by whispers from the warp, and now instruments of unimaginable cruelty. The word-bearers arrived under a blackened sky, a fleet of ships cloaked in the foreboding aura of the warp. Their descent was precise, their movements deliberate, as if the universe itself bowed to their will. Within the flagship, Lorgar surveyed the approaching battlefield with calm calculation. He understood the psychological weight of this encounter. His men were not merely warriors. They were priests of ruin, instruments of faith turned toward annihilation. Every word, every ritual, every act of violence was designed to break the spirit of the defenders as much as their bodies. The first volleys of fire struck before dawn. Orbital bombardments tore through the loyalist defenses, and the ground itself seemed to erupt in fury. Loyalist artillery returned fire, but their counterattacks were hampered by misinformation and sabotage. Sensors flickered, communications faltered, and soldiers hesitated when confronted with the chaos around them. Every shot fired seemed to carry more than just physical force. It carried the weight of betrayal, the knowledge that those they once called brothers now sought their destruction. In the trenches, a young ultramarine sergeant rallied his men. Sweat and grime streaked his face, and blood from minor wounds mixed with the mud underfoot. He shouted orders, trying to instill courage, but the terror in his men's eyes mirrored his own. They fought not only against the word-bearers, but against the creeping dread that loyalty itself had become a weapon against them. Every enemy who fell revealed a face they recognized, a comrade now twisted by the heresy, and every victory tasted of ash. Above, in the swirling maelstrom of the warp, psychic disturbances intensified. The Thousand Suns, working in secret to manipulate the battlefield, sent waves of psychic energy that twisted perception and reality. Loyalists saw enemies that were not there, shadows where none existed, and whispers in their minds that seeded doubt and fear. One platoon, convinced they were surrounded, turned on each other in panic before reinforcements could arrive. In those moments, the heresy was not just an army of traitors. It was a virus of despair, infecting the minds of the loyal even as their bodies fought valiantly. Horus, observing these developments from his command ship, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had orchestrated this chain of events with the precision of a master tactician. Yet, even as his forces triumphed tactically, he understood the cost. Millions of loyalists had perished, and yet the empire still breathed. The resilience of humanity was astonishing, infuriating, and necessary to break if his vision of a new imperium was to succeed. Every defeat he inflicted was a lesson for the survivors. Every victory a message of inevitable consequence on the battlefield. The word-bearers pressed forward, their movements coordinated and ruthless. Lorgar himself descended, his presence like a shadow of doom. His voice, amplified psychically, carried chants that resonated through the minds of loyalists, eroding courage and instilling fear. Soldiers fell to their knees, some praying, some screaming, and others succumbing to the psychic horrors that clawed at their sanity. The battle was no longer merely physical. It was spiritual, mental, and cosmic in scope. Amid the chaos, acts of heroism persisted. A squad of loyalists, cut off from command, held a bridge against overwhelming odds, refusing to yield even as casualties mounted. Their sergeant, a veteran of countless campaigns, rallied his men with defiance and courage that seemed almost superhuman. Each kill, each defensive maneuver, was a testament to human resilience, and yet the battle around them consumed everything. For every enemy they felled, another seemed to rise in its place, fueled by rage, corruption, and the dark whispers of the warp. The psychological toll was severe. Men who had once fought with unwavering confidence now hesitated, haunted by the faces of friends turned enemies. The line between loyalty and survival blurred, and some soldiers questioned the very meaning of duty. Could they fight without becoming monsters themselves? Could they uphold the Emperor's ideals in a galaxy where betrayal was omnipresent? Each choice carried weight, and hesitation could be fatal. Horus' strategy extended beyond the battlefield. His agents infiltrated supply lines, intercepted reinforcements, and manipulated local politics to sow additional chaos. Worlds that might have remained loyal found themselves destabilized from within, as governors, commanders, and advisors succumbed to bribery, fear, or subtle coercion. Entire populations were turned against one another, as suspicion and paranoia replaced trust. In this way, the heresy was not merely a war of armies. It was a war of systems, societies, and souls. The loyalist response was fierce but fragmented. Without coherent command, each isolated unit fought as best it could, improvising strategies, fortifying positions, and attempting to hold the line. On some worlds, local militias joined surviving loyalist forces, swelling numbers, but also creating logistical challenges. Communication between planets became critical, yet the threat of interception or manipulation by traitor forces made coordination nearly impossible. Every message, every order, every reinforcement had to be weighed against the possibility that it was a trap. In the midst of this, smaller stories of human courage and tragedy unfolded. On one mining world, a platoon of loyalists rescued a group of civilians trapped under collapsed tunnels caused by orbital bombardments. They fought with whatever weapons they had, turning industrial machinery into makeshift defenses and holding the line until evacuation ships arrived. Yet even as they saved lives, they knew that the next wave of betrayal could undo all their efforts in an instant. Each victory was temporary, fragile, and earned at terrible cost. Back aboard the vengeful Spirit, Horus reflected on the unfolding chaos. He had always known that victory would require more than brute force. It required manipulation, subtlety, and an understanding of human nature at its most vulnerable. He had studied the hearts of men, the bonds of brotherhood, and the fragility of loyalty. Every step of the heresy was calculated, every decision weighed against both immediate gain and long-term consequence. And yet, he recognized that even he could not control everything. The universe was vast, and chance, human error, and unpredictable courage could disrupt the best-laid plans. In the thick of battle, the cost of betrayal became painfully clear. Entire regiments of loyalists were annihilated, yet some units held against impossible odds, their courage a silent rebuke to Horus' ambitions. The galaxy watched and waited, even as stars burned, worlds fell, and legions clashed with fury that would echo across centuries. Each engagement was a testament to the complexity of the heresy, the intertwining of strategy, psychology, and morality in a conflict that defied simple understanding. It'd be why the end of the first large-scale engagements. Both sides were battered, scarred, and aware of the scope of what they faced. Loyalists mourned the loss of brothers, civilians, and entire worlds. Traitors celebrated victories, but even their hearts were touched by moments of doubt or awe at the determination of those who resisted. The galaxy itself seemed to shiver under the weight of the war, as if aware of the immense tragedy unfolding among the stars. The grim reality of the Horus Heresy was undeniable. This was not a war that could be won with mere force. It was a war of ideals, will, and survival. Every soldier, every commander, every Primarch was tested to the limit. Loyalty was no longer a guarantee, honor a fragile concept, and survival itself a moral question. The galaxy had become a battlefield of the mind and soul, as much as of armor and weaponry, and the echoes of this conflict would resonate for millennia. Even as the fires of Kolth burned and the bodies of loyalist and traitor alike littered the plains, the universe waited, trembling. Horus had struck the first major blow, yet he knew the war was far from over. The galaxy would bleed, civilizations would crumble, and countless lives would be lost before the ultimate confrontation with the Emperor could come. And through it all, one truth remained. The heresy was not a battle between good and evil, but a grim reflection of ambition, betrayal, and the frailty of the human heart in the face of power. The galaxy was unraveling faster than any loyalist commander could comprehend. Even as the battles of Kolth and Istvan III echoed across the stars, other sectors began to fracture under the insidious reach of the heresy. Fleets once loyal to the Emperor now acted on their own, some openly rebelling, others sowing confusion through sabotage and misinformation. The Loyalists were fighting a war on multiple fronts, not only against traitor legions, but against the pervasive doubt that had begun to poison hearts and minds across the Imperium. The traitor Primarchs, each driven by ambition, rage, or devotion to the dark gods, began to assert their influence more aggressively. Ongron, consumed by his own bloodlust, carved a path of destruction across a cluster of mining worlds. The World Eater's tactics were simple but devastating: overwhelm, slaughter, and inspire terror. The survivors of his assaults would tell stories that would haunt generations, of entire cities emptied in a matter of hours, and of warriors whose faces were twisted in rage, driven to madness by the psychic resonance of the butcher's nails implanted deep in their brains. Each kill, each act of wanton violence, was a testament to the way war had turned into ritualized carnage. Fulgrim, meanwhile, pursued a different kind of destruction. The Emperor's standards of perfection, the endless pursuit of order and beauty, had become his obsession. He had begun introducing his own soldiers to demonic influences, subtly warping their perceptions until they sought aesthetic transcendence through violence. In his campaigns, entire battlefields became theaters of art and slaughter, each strike choreographed, each explosion designed to evoke awe and terror simultaneously. To Fulgrim, the heresy was not just a rebellion. It was a masterpiece in motion, a demonstration of the potential of humanity unshackled from the Emperor's constraints. Yet, even among the traitors, discord festered. The philosophy of Lorgar and the Word-Bearers clashed with Angren's simple rage and Fulgrim's perfectionist obsession. Strategically, they were aligned under Horus guidance, but personal ambitions, conflicting methods, and the subtle influence of the warp created tension that threatened to destabilize their efforts. Horus, patient and calculating, worked tirelessly to mediate these conflicts, understanding that the cohesion of his rebellion was fragile. The fate of the galaxy depended not only on the strength of his armies, but on the control he maintained over those whose loyalties were bought with whispers of power and promises of glory. That on loyalist worlds, the toll of the heresy was visible in every scar and every shattered city. Administrators, once confident in their command of planetary defenses, found themselves powerless as trusted officers turned traitor, communications faltered, and reinforcements never arrived. One planetary governor, watching the sky fill with incoming traitor cruisers, realized that even his most loyal soldiers could not resist the psychological manipulation that had begun to infiltrate their minds. Some deserted, some betrayed, and others simply froze in indecision, unable to reconcile the horror before them with the orders they had sworn to follow. The warp itself seemed to respond to the upheaval. Psychic storms raged unpredictably across battlefields, distorting reality, scrambling communications, and amplifying the fears of loyalist forces. These storms were not merely natural phenomena. They were echoes of the heresy itself, shaped by the psychic influence of the traitor Primarchs and their demonic allies. In the midst of one such storm, a squad of Imperial fists found themselves trapped in a labyrinthine canyon, their bolters misfiring, their sensors blinded, and their sense of direction warped. Every decision became a gamble, every movement a potential trap, and every whisper of fear magnified into a howl of terror that threatened to undo the discipline for which their chapter was renowned. Across the stars, smaller skirmishes erupted, each contributing to the psychological and logistical collapse of the Imperium. Scout ships reported worlds falling into chaos, militias rioting against corrupt officials, and populations turning on one another in fear and desperation. Loyalist commanders struggled to prioritize threats, knowing that no response could cover every front. They moved like generals in a storm, reacting rather than directing, constantly adjusting to an enemy that was both everywhere and nowhere. Amid this chaos, moments of profound heroism appeared, stark against the backdrop of despair. On a jungle-covered world in the eastern fringe, a small contingent of loyalist soldiers, cut off from communication and supplies, held a vital relay station against repeated assaults. They were vastly outnumbered, suffering casualties with every wave of attack, yet they refused to surrender. Their courage inspired nearby militias, who, in turn, helped reinforce the perimeter. The commander of the squad, a battle-hardened captain, refused to leave his men, refusing evacuation even when offered safe passage. Each stand, each defensive maneuver, became a symbol of defiance against the galaxy-wide rot that Horus had unleashed. The traitor legions, however, had their own trials. The seductive influence of the warp, while empowering, was unpredictable. The psychic energies channeled by the Thousand Suns often spiraled beyond control, creating anomalies that destroyed both friend and foe. Fulgrim's obsession with beauty occasionally led to tactical blunders, as the desire to create perfection on the battlefield delayed decisive action. Even Angren's rage, while effective in direct combat, made him vulnerable to traps and manipulation. Horus' leadership was the glue holding the rebellion together, and his absence from any sector of command could have disastrous consequences to Dontera. The Emperor felt the shifting tides of war in a way that no mortal could fully comprehend. He had anticipated rebellion, had foreseen the corruption of Horus to a degree, but the scale and speed of the heresy shocked even his godlike perception. Reports from loyalist commanders, filtered and delayed, painted a picture of widespread chaos and human suffering that was almost unbearable. The Emperor understood that intervention on a galactic scale would be necessary, yet he also knew that direct engagement could jeopardize the survival of loyalist forces already under siege. His mind, a well of psychic foresight, worked tirelessly to anticipate the moves of the War Master. Yet even he recognized the limits imposed by free will, chance, and the unpredictable cruelty of war. Meanwhile, in the shadows of contested space, spies and saboteurs moved like phantoms. Traitor forces infiltrated loyalist fleets, corrupting machinery, tampering with navigation systems, and even assassinating key officers. The very concept of security had become meaningless. Every trusted ally could be a traitor, and every routine procedure a trap. Loyalist commanders responded with paranoia, conducting audits, interrogations, and counterintelligence. Yet even these measures were imperfect. The galaxy itself had become a battlefield not only of armies, but of trust and suspicion. The galaxy had become a crucible of fire and shadow. Systems burned, fleets vanished, and entire populations disappeared beneath the relentless tide of the Horus Heresy. The conflict had grown beyond isolated battles or skirmishes. It was now a galaxy-wide conflagration, a test of loyalty, endurance, and the human spirit. Every sector seemed to echo with the screams of the fallen and the psychic resonance of the warp, as the universe itself trembled beneath the scale of ambition, betrayal, and destruction. That in the Segmentum Obscurus, a critical supply hub for loyalist forces, was under siege. The Iron Hands, renowned for their discipline and unyielding fortitude, had been dispatched to reinforce the world, yet even their legendary resilience was tested. Orbital bombardments reduced cities to molten ruin before they could be evacuated, and traitor legions infiltrated the planetary defenses with cunning subtlety. Soldiers fought alongside civilians caught in the crossfire, their hearts torn between duty and the instinct to protect life. Every choice was a gamble, and every victory carried a bitter aftertaste. Horus, aboard the vengeful spirit, orchestrated his strategy with meticulous precision. He monitored multiple sectors simultaneously, coordinating the movements of traitor fleets, legions, and agents. His mind was a vast machine of calculation, predicting outcomes, exploiting weaknesses, and shaping battles before they began. Even the Primarchs who followed him sometimes questioned the morality of their actions, yet his authority, charisma, and apparent infallibility kept them aligned. To challenge Horus was not merely to question a leader. It was to risk the wrath of a godlike warrior whose cunning rivaled the Emperor himself. Among the traitor legions, the psychological toll was palpable. Angren's rage was a weapon and a liability. His assaults were devastatingly effective, yet they occasionally left openings that even Horus could not predict. Fulgrim's obsession with perfection created moments of brilliance and disaster alike, as aesthetic considerations sometimes delayed decisive strikes. Lorgar's rituals, while powerful, occasionally backfired, creating psychic anomalies that destabilized even friendly forces. Horus' presence, the linchpin of their rebellion, was required constantly to maintain cohesion, to prevent infighting and hesitation from undermining the grand plan that on the front lines, the Loyalists faced horrors that would be etched into their memories forever. At a remote colony world in the Ultima Segmentum, a battalion of White Scars encountered an ambush set by a combination of traitor forces and demonic entities. The sky burned with fire from orbiting ships, while below, infantry squads fought through streets littered with debris, corpses, and the psychic echoes of the fallen. Soldiers faced the horrifying sight of friends turned into monsters, their bodies warped by warp-tainted energies, their minds enslaved to the will of Horus. Every engagement tested not only skill and courage, but the very capacity to retain humanity amid incomprehensible horror. In response, Loyalist forces began experimenting with unconventional tactics. Scouts, saboteurs, and small elite units were deployed behind enemy lines to disrupt the momentum of traitor legions. On one industrialized world, a company of Loyalists rigged manufacturing plants to explode at critical moments, slowing Angren's advance and providing a narrow window for evacuation. Each operation required immense courage, as failure often meant death or capture. Yet even in these desperate measures, the flame of resistance burned brightly. The Emperor, aware of the heresy's accelerating spread, acted with measured decisiveness. From the Golden Throne, his psychic presence extended across the stars, attempting to stabilize Loyalist command structures, bolster the morale of scattered forces, and anticipate Horus maneuvers. Yet the scale of the betrayal meant that even his godlike foresight could not fully counteract the subtle and pervasive manipulations of the War Master. Systems continued to fall, planets were lost, and the human cost mounted by the millions. Still, the Emperor's influence remained a beacon, a tether for the loyal amidst the storm of chaos. Psychological warfare became a defining feature of the heresy. The word-bearers' rituals sowed doubt and despair, creating visions of betrayal and disaster among Loyalist troops. Soldiers began to question every order, every command, every relationship. Even seasoned veterans found their discipline tested, as the whispers of the warp amplified fear, paranoia, and grief. Entire units fractured under the invisible pressure of manipulation, turning the heresy into a war fought as much within the minds of men as across the void of space. Amid this relentless horror, stories of heroism emerged like embers against a dark horizon. A squad of salamanders, isolated behind enemy lines, held a critical supply depot for weeks, repelling repeated assaults while tending to civilian refugees. Their commander, scarred by decades of campaigns, inspired his men through acts of personal bravery, risking his life repeatedly to shield others. These acts of courage reminded the galaxy that even in the shadow of betrayal, human resolve and morality could endure. Every small victory, every act of compassion, became a statement against the tide of corruption sweeping through the stars. The conflict among the Primarchs deepened. Even as they followed Horus, personal ambitions clashed with strategic necessity. Angren's impatience sometimes overrode Horus' careful planning, resulting in both spectacular victories and catastrophic losses. Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection occasionally delayed assaults, frustrating more pragmatic commanders. Lorgar's fanaticism sometimes created instability in forces not fully prepared for the psychic consequences of his rituals. Horus, ever watchful, mediated disputes with a mixture of charm, threat, and psychological insight, understanding that the cohesion of the traitor coalition was as fragile as it was powerful. In the meantime, the warp itself responded to the escalating conflict. Psychic storms surged unpredictably, sometimes isolating entire fleets, sometimes amplifying the power of those attuned to its currents. The Thousand Suns, in particular, found their sorceries both a boon and a threat, as the energies they channeled occasionally spiraled beyond control. Ships disappeared, warp rifts tore open near battlefields, and even seasoned commanders had to account for phenomena that defied reason. In many ways, the galaxy itself had become an instrument of the heresy, bending to the psychic influence of traitor legions and the chaotic currents of the warp. Loyalist forces adapted wherever possible. Isolated commanders learned to anticipate traitor strategies, civilians were trained to aid in defensive efforts, and supply chains were rerouted through obscure paths to avoid interception. Even as systems fell and legions suffered, the determination to survive and resist remained. These efforts were fraught with danger, and losses were high, but the resilience of humanity proved astonishing. Every stand, every evacuation, every battle won against overwhelming odds was a testament to the enduring spirit of those who refused to submit. The human cost continued to mount. Millions perished across countless worlds, and the psychological scars on survivors were profound. Soldiers wrestled with grief, anger, and moral conflict, questioning the very meaning of loyalty and duty. Every victory came with the knowledge that it might be temporary. Every stand carried the weight of potential betrayal. Yet even in this maelstrom, some leaders rose above despair, guiding their forces with clarity and courage, ensuring that the spirit of resistance remained unbroken. As the heresy spread further into the galaxy, the scale of destruction became almost unimaginable. Entire sectors were destabilized, economies collapsed, and populations were decimated. Civilizations that had thrived for centuries now teetered on the brink of extinction, and the very fabric of the Imperium was being tested as never before. Horus' ambition seemed unstoppable, and yet the resilience of the human spirit persisted in small, defiant pockets across countless worlds. By the end of this phase, the galaxy was scarred and trembling. Loyalist and traitor legions alike bore the weight of countless battles, psychic disturbances, and moral compromise. The stage was set for the next monumental confrontations, where the ultimate stakes, the survival of humanity itself, would become ever more apparent. The heresy had already rewritten the rules of war, morality, and loyalty, and the outcome remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the galaxy had entered an era of darkness, and the price of betrayal would be written in blood across the stars. The galaxy had become a canvas of fire, shadow, and despair. Entire sectors lay in ruins, their planets scarred by orbital bombardments, psychic storms, and the relentless tide of traitor legions. Yet amid the devastation, the remnants of loyalist forces persisted, battered but unbroken. They had learned, through bitter experience, to anticipate betrayal, to adapt to the horrors of the warp, and to fight not only for territory, but for the very soul of humanity. These were men and women hardened by loss, whose courage now burned brighter against the shadow of Horus' ambition. Horus, aboard the vengeful spirit, felt the weight of his choices as never before. The galaxy trembled under his designs, yet even in the apex of his power, he sensed cracks, small, almost imperceptible, but dangerous nonetheless. Some of his traitor Primarchs questioned methods or delayed actions. Others were consumed by the extremes of rage, perfection, or devotion to the dark gods. Horus knew that one misstep could unravel everything he had built. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that his vision of a galaxy remade, cleansed of the Emperor's constraints, justified the immense suffering he had caused on the worlds closest to Terra. Loyalist resistance had begun to consolidate. Surviving legions, together with planetary militias, coordinated in unprecedented ways, sharing intelligence, supplies, and strategies. The Emperor's influence, though diminished by distance and interference, became a guiding beacon. Leaders who had once operated independently now formed alliances, pooling forces for maximum effect. It was not enough to repel the traitor legions in individual battles. Victory required a unified, coordinated strike, and the Loyalists, battered and wary, began to take the first steps toward that monumental challenge. The final confrontation in the system near Horus' flagship was inevitable. Loyalist forces, led by Primarchs untouched by corruption, prepared meticulously. Every fleet, every battalion, every squad was positioned with precision. They had studied the patterns of Horus' campaigns, anticipated his traps, and trained relentlessly. Yet, even with such preparation, the cost would be unimaginable. They knew they faced not just armies of traitors, but the embodiment of betrayal itself, a war master whose tactical brilliance and charisma had brought the galaxy to its knees. The battle commenced with terrifying intensity. Warships clashed in the void, casting streams of fire and debris across the dark canvas of space. Boarding actions turned ships into maelstrom of close combat, where loyalist warriors confronted traitor brothers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the psychic resonance of countless minds in torment. On the surface of planets below, civilians and soldiers alike fought to survive the chaos, sometimes witnessing battles that would become legends or nightmares across the Imperium. Horus and the Emperor finally faced one another. The psychic presence of the Emperor radiated across the battlefield, a force of pure authority, of love and judgment, of reason and power. Horus met him with rage, ambition, and defiance. Yet even he felt the immensity of what he was up against. Their duel was not merely physical but cosmic in scale, each strike shaking fleets, each word a clash of ideology and will. Horus unleashed every weapon, every psychic manipulation, every lesson in strategy he had learned, and yet the Emperor countered with centuries of experience, insight, and a vision of humanity unshackled from corruption. The Loyalists pressed from every angle. Angren's fury, Fulgrim's obsession, and Lorgar's rituals were all brought to bear, yet the disciplined and resolute Loyalists found ways to exploit fractures in the traitor coalition. Communication breakdowns, minor dissent among Primarchs, and the unpredictability of human courage turned the tide in key engagements. Every victory was paid for with blood, and the cost of failure was unimaginable, yet the survivors pressed on, determined that Horus' vision of a corrupted galaxy would not prevail in the midst of the chaos. Horus confronted the ultimate choice. He could continue his path of destruction, risking total annihilation of both Loyalists and his own forces, or he could face the Emperor directly, accepting the mortal risk in pursuit of his goal. The galaxy, already scarred and bleeding, seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, Horus glimpsed the enormity of his betrayal, the lives extinguished, the worlds destroyed, and the irreparable damage wrought by ambition and rage. Yet his pride and conviction refused to bend. He struck with unmatched ferocity, every move calculated to test the Emperor, to prove the righteousness of his rebellion. The duel reached its apex. Energy crackled across the battlefield as psychic powers collided, as the War Master and the Emperor matched thought with thought, strike with strike. Ships shattered, armies faltered, and the very warp seemed to ripple with the intensity of their conflict. Every loyalist and traitor watched in awe and horror, understanding that the future of the galaxy rested on the outcome of a struggle between two godlike beings. Brothers once bound by loyalty, now divided by ambition and ideology. Ultimately, the cost of betrayal became Horus' undoing. Though his power and cunning were immense, the Emperor's vision, tempered by millennia of experience and unshakable resolve, proved insurmountable. Horus fell, mortally wounded, his life extinguished by the very brother he had once revered. Yet even in death, his legacy was terrifyingly profound. A galaxy forever scarred, legions forever fractured, and the shadow of the heresy lingering over humanity for millennia. The survivors of the Loyalist legions mourned the millions lost, honored the heroism of the fallen, and began the arduous process of rebuilding. Entire worlds required reconstruction, shattered societies needed guidance, and the psychological scars of betrayal would endure for generations. The Emperor, gravely wounded, returned to the Golden Throne, sustaining humanity's fragile civilization while ensuring that the Imperium endured. The galaxy had survived, but it would never be the same. The heresy had proven that even the mightiest could be corrupted, that ambition and deceit could topple empires, and that the cost of loyalty could be counted in the millions of lives sacrificed. Yet amid the devastation, the human spirit endured. Small acts of heroism, courage, and morality had persisted throughout the conflict, becoming the foundation for the Imperium's recovery. The scars of the heresy would serve as both warning and memory, a testament to the consequences of betrayal and the enduring strength of loyalty. And while the galaxy remained a place of war, darkness, and political intrigue, the legacy of those who resisted the War Master's corruption endured as a beacon of hope and resilience. The grim reality of the Horus Heresy was clear. War was not a contest of good versus evil, but a reflection of ambition, morality, and human fragility. Heroes and villains alike were defined by choices, courage, and the weight of consequence. And in the end, even in a universe torn asunder, the enduring lesson remained. Loyalty, honor, and humanity could survive, even amid the deepest darkness, if enough were willing to stand and fight.